We're ready for our next item.
Under operations, none submitted. Finance budget report. Administration will update the board on the development of the district's 2016-17 budget. This item provides an opportunity for the board's information and discussion.
Good evening. Yep, we're on. President Arnold, Superintendent Allison, members of the board. This is about 2 to 3 months earlier than what we've started this process in the past, at least as far as reports to the board. However, it's not really that much in advance of when we usually start the budget process. Because of the information you'll see tonight that I'll present to you, you'll understand why we need to start having the conversations much sooner this year than what we've had in the past. The budget process that we will use this year is not a whole lot different than what we've done in the past. We will look at several big pieces of our budget in terms of designing and developing the budget. We will look at any potential new revenue or loss of revenue as kind of a first course of action, because quite frankly, the revenue is what sets our maximum budget. We don't go out and pick numbers up and develop a budget. Our maximum budget is really developed by or determined by what legislatively what is appropriated for us legislatively, in other words, what the revenue that comes into us. And this year, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, because of the 2-year block grant, we know what that revenue is going to be from the state. So once we get the revenue kind of looked at, then we start looking at our cost increases that we may have to put into place, and or any kind of decreases in costs that might be there. Then we'll work on developing assumptions as we have in the past, as we get closer to the development in terms of assessed valuation, enrollment, and those types of things, with the goal and the intent that we'll develop a balanced budget based on educational priorities as we get clear out to the end of the process, which, as you know, is really in August, but we will pretty much have the budget determined by the time you get into your July meetings, because then we're putting the final touches on it. So let's talk first a little bit about estimated revenues. And normally this process doesn't happen until much later, just because the legislature has not acted. And in this year, the state block grant has already been approved for the fiscal year 17 with the funds appropriated. And the way that it is done this year is that revenue really is frozen pretty much at this year's level, actually last year's level. But I have a big if here, if that block grant is fully funded. And while on one side of the fence we are told that that money is guaranteed, on another side of the fence we're also hearing that some of it may be in jeopardy. And of course, we don't have any control over that. We don't know really what's going to happen. So we start at this point knowing what we know, that the block grant will be funded, and essentially our revenue will be flat that's coming from the state. So, and you may hear talk about cuts and that sort of thing. Well, and I'd be upfront right to the beginning to say that the state has not cut our budget. And the revenue remains flat, but they have not cut our budget either. And I'll try and refrain from using that term too much, but because it really isn't true. The state has been funding us at a higher level, as we've said in the past. Not all of that revenue we can put into our operating expenses, but the operating expenses for the most part are flat for us for next year. The only place where there's a revenue decrease for us for next year is by our own design. We committed $3 million of contingency reserve into this year's budget for operating funds. And it will be my recommendation that we do not continue with that path because we're now down to $10 million in contingency reserve. So that $3 million that we use this fiscal year we'll have to replace as we move forward.
And Mr. Freeman, while $10 million sounds like a great deal of money on a business operation our size, that's roughly about 6
6
days
days.
of operating expenses.
Yes, about 6 days.
Excuse me, and the other point, even though it's showing an increase, it's a good time to factor in that that increase still is not kept pace with cost of living.
Yeah. Exactly. Our costs are increasing at a typical rate that you would think of regular costs are, but the revenue coming in has not kept pace with that. Yeah. Excuse me. So we get into the fun part of trying to estimate cost increases, and you're going to see low numbers and high numbers this time because that's really how I start the whole process in terms of trying to determine what those cost increases are. We're very early in the process right now. There's still a lot of unknowns, and the numbers will change as we move forward. And we're constantly working on revisions of these cost estimates using our own expert staff and then anybody else outside that can give us some experience or their expertise. And the slides that I'm going to present, there's basically a slide or a couple of slides for each cost area center. And then there'll be a summary at the end, so you don't have to worry about sitting there adding all the numbers up because I do give you a summary at the end. So the first one I want to talk about is the estimated cost increases in utilities. It's electricity, heating, fuel, water, and sewer. And I'm going to talk about several things that are driving some of this just so you have a better understanding of that. Next year, our bond projects are coming to a close where we have our last projects bid now, and next year we will add 367,350 square feet to our inventory. And that's really spread over 6 locations, Brooks, Caldwell, Coleman, Curtis, Robinson, and the new Southeast High School. So again, this is the end of our projects and anticipating what we would be doing here. We also have the West Star rate increase that will continue to haunt us for a while. And one of the anomalies for next year is as we move into the new high school, we transition out of the old high school and move district staff down to the old Southeast, we will have under tow the AMAC building for at least 6 months while we are making that transition. So we'll have some utility costs in the next fiscal year associated with that building that will fall off maybe after 6 months or whenever we do get out of the building. So, and also with AMAC, not only do we have the utilities that we're paying, but we're also paying a lease on it and we pay the taxes on it. So those expenditures will be the last year for them for next year. So,
Lynn has a question now, Jim.
I guess I just want to remind people, I do know we're adding more space because of the new buildings, but one of the benefits we've had in the last 8-10 years is as we've renovated space, we've replaced windows, we have tried to use less utilities, less energy, less water. I think even our water bill, while it has not gone down, I think it's probably doubled. Our usage has almost been cut in half because of the efficiencies that we've been putting in place. And then we also challenged the West Star rate increase, which saved us quite a bit of money. So I guess I want our taxpayers to know that we continue to do everything we can to keep those costs down. Yes, timing is of some of our new buildings, but that's also a benefit that we're going to be able to move out of some older, inefficient space as well. So.
yes, absolutely. And one of the things that's on this slide here too is we really are efficient with our utilities. And when we look at my estimates here, my low estimate really is looking at just the increased square footage and the rate changes. The high estimate that I have here of $1 million is really allows for the possibility of a heating fuel increase. Right now, most of our heating is natural gas and very low rates right now. That will not continue forever. So I've built into this kind of a fudge factor, if you want to call it that, for when you look at that. But one of the things that's kind of interesting, and again, it speaks to our drive towards that efficiency, is this year, fiscal year 16's budget for all of these utilities is about $11 million. And when you calculate that out, that's $1.03 per square foot for utilities. I would say that's a pretty good efficiency rating for us in terms of our facilities. But I would indicate to you, somebody's going to sit here, okay, $1.03 times that, the 376,000 square feet doesn't add up to $675,000 of increased costs. And part of that is because in the first year of operation, any new facility is going to run a little bit higher utility rates until everything gets balanced, and then those utility rates will really come down. So, and again, part of our unknown in this is that the new high school is actually not under Westar. It's under a new rate structure with Butler County Electrical Co-op, and we will be learning as we go, so to speak, on some of their rate charges, their demand charges, and that sort of thing. So our expert, Mr. David Banks, has done an excellent job making the projections, and we have some contingency things in place for being able to adapt and address those rates that Butler County may be throwing at us. So $675,000 on the low end, $1 million on the high end. And again, those are 6% and 9% increases, based on the total budget area that's there. Transportation is the next topic. Our contract with First Student has a consumer price index escalator built into it, but they always measure it in December, and the CPI in December actually was negative. So it'll be a zero increase on that escalator part of it. So the increases that you're looking at here are increases that might be necessary if we have to add buses to our runs. Transportation will be one of those that we'll look at very, very closely as we develop this and try and minimize these costs as much as we can. Anytime you open a new school and you start moving students in different places, you're going to have some adjustments that we'll have to make. The vehicle fuel is the next one, and it flows right along the same way with the transportation costs. Fuel cost increases. Right now, our fuel costs are fairly low, but we know that they'll come up, and then the potential for new bus routes may be hitting us there. We do have a little bit of leeway with our fuel costs. The district owns and maintains a 200,000 gallon reserve fuel tank that we used and replenished this summer, and that 200,000 gallons, if we were to run out of budget and use that fuel, would actually take us 4 to 6 weeks of student transportation. But it's there for a reason, not only for our buses, but it is also our reserve fuel for heating in case we were to get a real spike in natural gas. We have a number of our buildings that also can work off of the diesel fuel as well. So it's there for a reason, but it's kind of our reserves, like we have our insurance reserves as well. The next one is property insurance, and we are self-insured with property insurance. However, we carry an excess cost insurance policy, just like we have stop loss on our health insurance and that type of thing. So we have an excess cost policy, And the trend on that one has been in the $180,000 to $200,000 increase every year. And so we anticipate there will be some increase there, plus we're adding square footage, as we said before. So there will probably be some premium increase on the, in that $200,000 range just to cover those increases. The high number that's here, as I indicated, we are self-insured, and we do carry reserves in our special reserve fund for property insurance. The last couple of years, we've actually not deposited any new funds in those reserves. We always look at those reserves at the end, toward we get to the end of the fiscal year, and make some determinations whether we need to bolster that fund a little bit. And I said we haven't really put very much money in there in the last couple of years, so it may be time for us to look at what we have to put in there. And it's really driven by the losses that are incurred, and we need to get through the springtime of the year to make sure we don't have any major hailstorms or that sort of thing as well. So,
A question on that, and again, just to be sure I am tracking, we are self-insured. Is there a time that you look at, is it more effective to remain self-insured versus the other? I mean, do we do some kind of analysis on that, or what?
well, as a matter of fact, we actually look a lot of places throughout the year, but as it turns out, we have started looking into pooled property and casualty insurance, and by pooling, it's where we would look at, say, the 6 to 10 largest school districts in the state, and have a cooperative effort with those districts to pool the property insurance. And basically, you're spreading the risk, and you're still putting money into it. It's not a premium. You're actually putting money into a pool that the claims are then paid from. And there's actually a couple of companies that we've started kind of investigating a little bit, and lo and behold, the A&M efficiency study also talks to that as well. So we're a little bit ahead of them on that particular thing. But yes, we do look at that. And it is something that we'll investigate. It's not one of those that happens real fast, so it takes some time for us to build that scenarios and get those estimates.
So when you look at pooling, then that really requires some significant upfront money?
It depends on how it
works.
starts, but you have to build that reserve.
Yeah.
And that would be a contribution from all of the school districts that would be involved. And usually the way the pooling works is it's based on what the exposure is, in other words, what your values are. So the higher your values, the more you have to pool into it. But again, us being self-insured and we have the reserves there, if we went that direction, the reserves would just be moved over to the pool.
And as I understand your initial question, do we look at, if we weren't self-insured and just did it through a premium basis, yes, it would be much, much more expensive. What we do is cover self-insurance and then have kind of that catastrophic, if we had to replace a whole building type of coverage, much like we do with our health insurance. We cover up to and then have a policy that would cover beyond that. If we were to try to provide the same type of coverage with a straight policy and premium, the cost would be significantly higher than our self-funded component.
And Joy has a question.
Jim, I was just wondering, because you said some of the cost increase for property insurance is because we have new space coming under our roofs. So for AMAC, after this year, will that go off, or has it already? We still cover our own insurance until
Yes.
we're out of the building.
Yes.
So in another year, that one would come off.
Yes.
So, all right. I just wanted to make sure I understood that piece. So that's just a 1 year, and then it'll So in a year from now, we should be getting really good news
Well,
about some of these costs. No, I'm just
I
kidding.
hate,
I'm just kidding.
well, I hate to say this, but, I would hope that when you're looking at budget next year, that your utility cost increases won't be there because we're dropping some things off and we're becoming more efficient, that sort of thing, so, yeah.
Depending on where we go with the property insurance, the potential pooling, whatever that may look like. The other piece that unfortunately is, as we look at increased cost for years to come, is we're also working through the process of about 20 of our buildings per year, we're having that those evaluated so that our cost coverage matches what the replacement cost would be. So that probably means we'll see, some of those incremental, well, we hope they're incremental, some increases each year over the next couple of years till we get all our properties reassessed and a lost dollar amount established at that point.
Then can I have a follow-up question on the transportation? You said the CPI escalator is measured in December, and that was negative, so we have a 0 for next year. So is there I suppose we don't have anything in our contract that says if the price goes down, we can
No, first thing we checked on.
So I don't
Hasn't
know when
happened
that
for so long, we
contract
didn't
is
think
up,
about
but
it.
perhaps the next time we negotiate, we should have conversation about that. We probably didn't expect
Very seldom do you ever
gas
see.
and oil to fall
Yeah.
apart like that. But
You're right.
but it has, and it has made the cost of things go down according to the CPI. I'm not sure if that's realistic or not, but thank you.
Any other questions on the property insurance? Okay. The next slide is on software costs. We typically have some sort of increased costs in software with just normal license renewals and that sort of thing, and additional types of just normal instructional software. And if I could rewind back a couple of years, the software increases a couple of years ago were quite a bit higher than this, just because of the way that our software licenses are laid out. So these look like big numbers, but they're actually somewhat lower than what we've had in the past. This would have been a very low year for the software increases, except for the fact that we're still assessing what we need to do on the security side of our software to protect us a little bit more. We had the incident earlier this year that we've now worked with several consultants and experts, and we'll be adding some security features to our network system to help protect us in the future for that. So some of the cost here with regard to that is in response to that breach that we did have. Although, and the other thing that we see a lot of times and that we'll be looking at is are we adding new instructional software and what the costs are for that? Because a lot of times we can wind up with what seems like a not real expensive piece of software, but when you offer it to, almost 100 buildings, those licenses add up pretty quickly. One of the things that we are investigating right now is Lexia. We have been using Lexia in our schools quite a bit. However, that was under a state contract, and we were not paying for that. And the state last year canceled that contract, and now there's another piece of software out there that is free to us that we're investigating and looking at that very closely. But no decision has really been made yet about how that might work. But the fact that we've used Lexia for so long and have the data that's behind that, we may be looking at trying to maintain that at least on some level moving in the future. But again, we're still in the discussion phases of that and don't really know exactly what's going to happen.
The software that Mr. Freeman referenced, the state did provide funding for Lexia. Last year, they decided to provide funding for a different program even though they provided a 3-year contract for that, the funding was only 1 year. And that funding was taken from the Children's Initiative Fund, which has now twice been hit to help balance the current budget. So the expectation is, given where the state is on its current budget, that there will probably be no funding in this next year for that software. So that means as we look at Lexia and assess how our buildings are using it, what success we've had, those types of things, then we have to balance is that an expense that we need to include in the budget moving forward, because it's a piece we want to keep. We've talked about looking at the change that the state made, except I'm hearing from KSDE and others that the likelihood of that being funded into the next budget is about nil. So we'll assess that, but need to, at this point in time, include that into our budget projections that we would begin to pick up the tab again for Lexia.
The next slide is the biggie. Our health insurance, what we need to be putting into the reserves, and I would, and we look at a $12 million number, and that looks pretty astronomical, but I would remind you that last year when we were looking at these same numbers, but this was out in April, we had a big number there too with special ed, and again we try and adjust as we move forward. So what is happening here is a district, again, totally self-funded on the health insurance, and the board contributes a certain amount per eligible employee into the health reserves. The health reserves then pay the claims. The district has not increased its contribution to the health plan since 2007, and at that time the reserves were pretty high. So for the last several years, we've known that at some point in time we were going to have to start increasing what goes into those health reserves, because the cash balances were coming down, because health costs, as is known, pretty much continue to increase. Although our health plan and our wellness plan really has performed extremely well. And it wasn't until about 3 years ago that the actual reserves really started coming down more. We are putting about $48 million a year in revenue into the health plan. We're spending about $62 to $65 million a year right now in claims. So we're dropping by about $12 million a year, and we are to the point now where we get to the end of this fiscal year, we're going to need to start putting some more money into those into the reserves. Now, I would indicate to you that a number of years ago, the board approved a trust for retiree health, and there's $10 million in that retiree trust, and we will use half of it in June of this year. To help pay for the retiree costs. The retiree claims run about $5 million a year. So we'll cover the cost of those claims at the end of this fiscal year, and then we'll have one more year where we can cover those costs again. So that will help the reserves also get us across the fiscal year and into the next moving into the next year. But as we look at and try and decide how we're going to deal with this, I have to look at it from the standpoint of this has to be general fund money at this point that goes into those health reserves, just because I don't have any other options at this point. So that's why this number is here. The low number here would cover the first 6 months of the fiscal year, July through December. $12 million would be required for the full fiscal year to be able to keep the reserves, and really that just keeps the reserves from evaporating completely on us. And we need to keep, we need to have about 3 months worth of reserves in place. And like I said, we're spending, you know, $5 million, say, a month in claims. So we need $12 to $15 million in our reserves just to keep it viable. So that's kind of the target for what we're trying to do with this. The next one is our textbook line, and again, this is one that the last couple of years I've come to you with to try and budget some more dollars in there. The fees that we collect are really insufficient to cover any costs of any new adoptions. We generate about $1 million in from parents paying a textbook fee. But we have a standing transfer in there of about $2.4 million right now, because we spend about $3 million on consumables for the elementary school and for just replacement of techs in a given year. So the money that's going in there won't provide enough funding for any new adoptions, and we're planning for a fairly large adoption, not next year, but the following year. So we need to try and build up some cash balances is in there right now. So a major adoption for us, if we were to look, K-12 might be as much as $10 million. So this is an effort to try and generate that. Now, the cash balance that we have in that fund right now is really pretty good. But it still would not support a major adoption for us.
Betty, I do have a question. I was going to ask about how much would be a major adoption, but let me ask on the consumables. Those would be like notebooks and things that go along with a textbook. Is that right?
This is, and where you see it is at elementary level, because the elementary has a lot of workbooks.
Yeah.
And that's primary. They're workbooks that are where the students do their activities and that sort of thing.
And they go in with the textbook. That's not something we could just copy because of copyright laws and things of that nature. If we're going to do the textbook, we need to have that notebook or separate, totally something separate that we develop ourselves that we would spend money on if we didn't use the workbook, I'm assuming.
Correct. There are some materials that we do copy ourselves, but again, that is a cost to us. It's not like buying a published version,
yeah.
but yeah, you're absolutely
have to kind
right.
of balance that.
Yes.
So. Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. This next one is also one that you see from me and from the department here, and trying to build in some budgetary increases for the enrollment increases that we see. And the trend over the last several years, it's been as low as well, this year I think we've used about $700,000, and I think last year it was about $3 million in terms of funding that we required as school was starting. And one of the anomalies that you see is that our enrollment increase hasn't been a high percentage, but we have pockets where we're putting, we have students going into primarily elementary schools is where we see this, and to be able to maintain some of our current class sizes, we typically are hiring teachers in August to try and address that. And then, of course, our high needs enrollments continue to climb, although this year the free and reduced count actually has started declining a little bit. But our English as a second language, our ELL kids, that number continues to go up. And so the high needs enrollment piece is one that we're always having to add some funding into. And I would indicate to you, as you well know, we did get some extraordinary needs funding this year, about $366,000 to assist with our refugee population. And at this point in time, I'm assuming that we will get that money again. But, we'll know more about that as we move forward. So that would be another piece of the puzzle that might change as we move forward. Plus, we don't know right now exactly how many refugee students we may have before we get to next year. So that number could also change. So here's the summary. And I have to say, the first time I ran these numbers myself, I kind of gulped. But as you look down through the list, and again,
Jim, I'm
these
sorry.
numbers will change.
Jim, before you go, Cheryl, is
Oh,
your
I'm
question
sorry.
now?
Sorry.
Okay.
I just had a question. You talked about the refugee population, and we did get some money, as you said.
Yes.
And the numbers, the counts have gone up since we got that money. Are we going back to the state again because they said we could?
Well, here's the interesting
I
thing
know there's
about
no
that.
money
You want
now.
to speak to the governor's budget?
Sure. At this point in time, we have not been informed that there will be any further meetings of that group because there's about 2.4 million that was unallocated, but in the governor's proposed budget, those funds were swept to help balance the budget for the end of the year. So if the governor's budget would be adopted, there would be no funds available for us to receive, and we'll just have to wait and see if that's a transfer that the legislature approves. If not, then there may be an opportunity to go back.
Okay. And just as a follow-up for all of us, we, meaning our school district and every other school district in the state, contributed to that fund, correct?
Yet we were required to contribute.
What percentage?
0.4%.
Okay.
For us, it was about $1.2 million. Yeah, about $1.2 million is what we gave up in regular general.
And we
fund
got
state.
back from them,
$366,000.
so we're almost $1 million shy out of our budget already for what we gave to the state and they swept to use on other things, correct?
Yes.
That would be where it stands at this point, yes.
And we think we may be able to get some more money next year?
Well, okay, assuming the block grant, which right now I am assuming the block grant will be funded as it stands, that there is extraordinary needs funding there. Actually, there's a little bit more next year than there was this year.
So they'll take more money from us next year?
Well, it's all based on that same percentage. And that's where it starts, the block grant was supposed to be a lot simpler, but when you get down into the details of it, it can be pretty confusing because one of the things that they also included in the block grant for this year and for next year is an increase in general state aid to us based on assessed valuation increase on the 20 mills. And in the governor's budget, that also got swept. So we had built into our budget this year about $1.3 million in what's called over proration state aid, which we will not get. We've already accounted for that, so there's no issue with our budget for this year. But next year, the revenue increases that were projected to come to us were based on that assessed valuation increase. So if they do the same thing next year, that funding may not be there. That's why I say there's some big ifs with regard to what they do. Now, if we get what we have been promised, and from a standpoint of them trying to hold that harmless, then that funding will be there, and certainly we'd go back for that plus whatever other enrollment. And based on what they provided for us this year, I would assume that we would get some funding there. But there's a big if there.
And just, you probably recall, when we built the budget last year, that assessed valuation we did not include in our budget, with the idea that if we received it, those would be dollars then that we could come back to you and see how you wanted to allocate or to offset other cost increase. But we did not believe we would receive it, so did not build it into our expenditure component of the budget. And I think that's probably the way we'll approach next year as well, is that
Absolutely.
We'll have to account for it in our budget, but we will not plan on or allocate those dollars because of kind of that nebulous status of whether we'll actually receive it or not.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. The summary lists all of the numbers that we just kind of went through. So we have a range of $14.7 million up to $27.3 million of projected cost increases. And as indicated, these numbers will change. But my low numbers are what I consider kind of the bottom end. I don't think that we'll go below those unless we make some conscious decisions not to do some things, and that's how part of the process will be. So as we kind of look through this and work through and analyze and try and figure out where we're going to be, the numbers will change, and then we'll gradually narrow that down to where we are dealing with just one number at some point in time, and hopefully that's sooner rather than later. Because when you think about even at the $14 million end of it, which is really where we were last year, we were able to do some things last year, and we used contingency reserve that we probably won't have available to us this time. So the decisions that we will have to make are going to be tough. But that's kind of the realm of the world that we're going to have to look at. Now, what are our next steps? We will continue to refine all of these cost estimates and try and get a better handle on that. I think we've captured all of the big ones. There may be some more that pop up as we develop this, but we've worked pretty hard at trying to narrow those numbers down. But then we have to begin the process of developing the strategies on how to cover those cost increases. Now, and again, I'll reiterate, where the state is not cutting our budget, at least as far as we know right now. So we'll have the same size budget next year, but because of the cost increases in some areas that some we can control, some we can't, we'll have to figure out ways to reduce budgets in other places to be able to provide for the funding we need for the ones that we can't control. So we'll spend some time again looking at educational priorities, and I put down at the bottom here short and long term. One of the things that I think becomes very important is for us to think beyond just next year, because the way it looks right now, the funding at the state, even in the best case scenario, you're going to have at least 2 years of reduced or budgets that aren't going to probably be able to fund what you really want to do. And that, in my opinion, is kind of a best case scenario. So you've got to look at in making decisions now, not only for just 1 year, but maybe 2 and maybe 3, because you may be in for some multiple years of hard times, and even if the revenues at the state do come back and do start to filter into us, it takes a while for that to catch up. So it'll be a challenge before that to happen. So in terms of identifying educational priorities, sometimes it's a matter of looking on out a little bit, because if we just knee-jerk react and make some changes that don't hurt us next year, but they may down the road, we have to be careful about that. So we'll be spending quite a bit of time identifying options on how to address these. We'll continue to analyze financial data. We have cost analysis on almost every program in the district at hand that we'll be working with. But really, we have to really analyze the impact that's going to be and the consequences that may happen right in our classrooms. So, questions?
Mike?
The one thing you haven't addressed, and maybe you're going to do this in the future, is this is what I call the small part of our budget. We're in the people business, and it doesn't include any increases in salaries for anybody that I've talked about. You know, what would be, if we were to sit here and say today it was a 2% random number, What would that increase to our budget be?
2% across the board would probably be somewhere in the $16 to $18 million range.
So we need to add another $20 million to this to cover,
And if you wanted to give salary increases, yeah.
right, and that's a concern too.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you, Jim, I
Mhm.
appreciate it.
No other questions? Okay, Cheryl?
I just wanted to follow up on the last thing that you said, because I think that's an important piece for us to begin to think about. We're looking at roughly $15 million to $28 million that we're going to have to find this year. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm hearing you say we may need to do that same thing next year and possibly even the year after that.
You know, it's when you think about the forget the politics for a minute. If the revenues in the state do start coming back at projections that we are hearing, it takes 12 to 18 months when you're talking about tax collections for that to really flow through the system and get to us. So that's part of the challenge in it. And of course we have lots of other anomalies out there that we don't know about yet. We haven't heard from the courts yet and things like that. But even in the best case scenarios, I don't think you're going to see revenues come back very quickly into the district for at least another year. My crystal ball doesn't really tell me a whole lot more than that, and that's just my gut feeling.
I think if you looked at the practicality, we're probably this budget, at least one more and most likely two. With the discussion currently in Topeka about not wanting to do anything with the school finance formula, the assumption is then that they would extend the block grant another year. So we would be in the third year of flat revenues, to which we'd have to offset budget decisions. That's if funding stays flat, and we know flat isn't flat. Any changes to a finance formula would have an impact, and then if there were changes, if revenues do not increase at the rate to offset what's been almost $3 billion worth of borrowing and deferred payments on over the last several years, then they'd have to have a conversation around tax structure again. And as Mr. Freeman said, that's another at least year, in most cases 18 months. So, when you think of it that way, realistically, we could be talking 2 to 3 budgets moving forward that we would not see any additional revenue. So that last bullet about thinking of, as we have to make some tough decisions coming up this spring, one of the short-term and long-term consequences, we've been fortunate over the last several budgets. There were some one-time maneuvers and some different things, contingent reserve usage we could take advantage of. Those are gone. With the hope that revenues and school finance would improve over the last 5 years, that hasn't been the case. It's been the exact opposite. So it's I do think we're going to have to take a longer view as we look at this budget and what that means really for at least 2 budget cycles and the decisions we make because of that.
Well, and that was my whole thing. I mean, we're looking at 1 year, and we really need to be looking much further down the road, because some cuts could happen this year, and we begin to say what can happen next year if we're in the same predicament. And it looks like we could be. Thank you for your presentation.
If I
joy.
might, a couple other things, kind of along the same thought. As we look at options, we've already had some. John and I have had some conversations about that, the long look at that. So we certainly will do that. And one of the other things that is out there that I'll make a quick comment about is Alvarez and Marsal efficiency study that's been done, and the recommendations that are there. We're still analyzing those. As a matter of fact, I'm in contact with that team in terms of adding information to it and answering some questions and getting answers to my questions and that sort of thing. So we don't know what the legislature will do or not do with that study too. There are some things in that could have some fairly significant impact to us in how we would operate or what we would be able to do as well. So so on the surface that the recommendations there look good. I think they were talking about saving $2 billion in across the state over a 5-year period, but there's still a lot of questions about the feasibility of some of those and whether they could be put into place. But we'll know more as we move forward. And the other comment that I would make is plan on seeing me in front of you just about every board meeting now as this develops, because we will start to have a lot more conversations as this develops and what we are trying to do with our options, so that you will we'll keep you informed, keep the public informed on what we're looking at, with the intent of making good decisions from the standpoint of the data that we're looking at. None of this is going to be fun, and when I say good decision, it's not so much a good thing to reduce our spending in a lot of these areas, but we have to make educated and conscious choices about how we build the budget. So,
Well,
Thank you.
it looks like that takes care of our questions, and
okay.
we look forward to seeing you again.